Happened once on the playground in the Bronx when a middle school girl was talking back to me a lot, and I escalated with her and was giving her detention and then adding days to the detention, and I was all upset. And the next morning I called her in to my office. The other is when people make mistakes towards me. I've had staff and students lash out, yell at me, send angry emails, and when I forgive them, that is powerful. And our relationship becomes stronger. They gave me an opportunity to tell them, it's okay. I realize you lost it. Let's not do that again. What happened that made you have an outburst? But let's move forward together. Really forgiving each other, having direct communication, and knowing we're all in this together.
This is the Engaging Leadership Show, where we uncover the stories and strategies behind successful educational leadership. In today's episode, we get into the nuts and bolts of leadership. What are some of the tools that leaders use to be able to lead effectively? Being able to listen with data, being able to run effective meetings and get everyone on the same page. Today's episode, we're going to be running a masterclass in both of these tools. I hope you enjoy and will be able to take away very tactical action plans from today's episode. On to the Engaging Leadership Show. Our guest today was a principal at the tender age of 28 at one of the 12 most violent schools in New York City. During that time, she restructured the school into 3 small learning communities, built the students' identities as readers, and led community walkthroughs to involve students, staff, and families in the instructional improvements that she was driving at that school. She is also a graduate of Yale University and did a doctorate at Harvard, and she took on her current role as a superintendent in 2021. Since then, she's led the district in creating an equity policy, increasing their use of data, and adopted a more balanced school calendar. It's a great privilege today to have in our studios Dr. Linda Rosenbury. She's the superintendent of Port Townsend School District in Washington State. Linda, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So tell us a little bit more about Port Townsend. What kind of district is it and how the community is?
So Port Townsend, Washington is on the tip of the Quimper Peninsula, which is on the tip of the Olympic Peninsula out in Washington State. So we're right across the water from Canada. We're a small community. We have 4 schools with about 1,200 students total. So we have an elementary school, a middle school, a high school, and then a K-12 alternative school, which includes an online school and a family partnership program.
Wonderful. You're right at the border. That's such a nice place to be in. I'm sure the weather is great. The scenery and the natural beauty that surrounds you is probably amazing. And one of the things that we spoke about in preparing for this episode was the unique way that you have been engaging and amplifying student voice in the district. Talk to me a little bit more about what that means to you and why that's important.
When I was in school to become a principal, they asked us to dig deep and find out what are our values? What do we care about being a leader? And for me at that time, it was being responsive, feeling like I understood the community that I was serving, had my finger on the pulse, and was really always making sure to listen and act on the things I was hearing. What I've learned since then is that responding to each person as they come at me can actually lead to a very fractured response and not hearing a full range of voices. And so I've become really passionate about student voice and family voice and staff voice and how to promote it through more comprehensive surveys, focus groups, and committees.
Got it. It's about having those one-to-one interactions and getting the nitty-gritty of that individual's lived experience, whether they're family, parents, parts of the community, staff, or students. But at the same time, what I'm hearing from you is there's this need to step back and look at things more strategically. And you do that using surveys. And before we get into the nuts and bolts of how you do that, how does it inform you in the day-to-day operations and in planning your strategic plans?
So the students are most impacted by the decisions that we make as a district, and families are impacted by the decisions we make as a district. So there are big ones every year that we make, whether it be about the courses we offer, the curriculum we choose, the policies we have around cell phones, the school calendar. So how do we space out the 180 days required by law? How long is our summer? So whenever there's a big decision that's coming up, we usually through a committee that also includes parents, look at some research, look at some examples, come up with some ideas, and then reach out to get more opinions. Sometimes we actually draft, here's what we think the right approach is, like the strategic plan was fully drafted by adults, and then we sent it out to students, and the students weighed in, and we took the feedback we heard there to make more minor changes along the way. So it's important that we have this constant loop and that we're improving the student experience. And any decision we're going to make, we've run it by the people who are going to be impacted, because often there are things we're missing from our perspective.
Yeah. One of the anchors of being able to take such an approach is the presence of trust. Trust in your judgment as superintendent, trust in the voices that you're gathering from the different stakeholder groups. How do you build that foundation? And you can go further back into your experience as well. I'm dealing with one of the most violent schools in New York City. That's a rough gig. But you managed to build trust even in that environment. How do you go about doing that? What's your secret sauce?
One-to-one interactions matter a lot, and then a lot of communication. Information flies in different ways in a school community, and it's important to know who talks to who, what people care about, what are the trigger topics, and how do I then get ahead of that in writing to put out the talking points that I think are most important for people to know and clear up confusion and have different messengers. So that's important. Listening is very important. And then also admitting when I'm wrong. I think the strongest moments in my career have been when I made a mistake and I went back to the person who was impacted and apologized. So it happened once on the playground in the Bronx when a middle school girl was talking back to me a lot, and I escalated with her and was giving her detention and then adding days to the detention, and I was all upset. And the next morning I called her in to my office, and she was obviously still pissed off at me. And I said, let's start again. I'm sorry. I don't like the way I acted yesterday. That was wrong of me. I was upset. I want to start again. Let's talk through this. And then our relationship was stronger than it would have been if I even hadn't made the mistake. The same thing happened with my staff this past year. It was teacher appreciation. AI had just come out in a big way in Washington State. And so I used ChatGPT to help me draft a message. And I included transparently in the PS what the prompts were I put into ChatGPT. And I heard immediately through the grapevine that some teachers were really offended. And so I reached out to them. I apologized. I talked to who was offended. And then I sent another message noting the negative impact that I had on some people. And some people wrote back, I've never seen a superintendent apologize like that. And so that built trust. And then other people were like, Linda, keep using AI. So it was an interesting, kind of a polarizing moment among the staff. But for me, what was most important was that I realized when I've negatively impacted someone, I take ownership for it, I reflect on it, and then they feel heard and our relationship becomes even stronger.
That's really powerful. The more authority and the higher you go in your career, the harder it is to say, I'm sorry. And how do you overcome that? What is it that guides you in those moments?
The concept of psychological safety coming from Amy Edmondson out of Harvard is all about how do we have a workplace where we talk about what went wrong for the purpose of improvement and avoiding mistakes instead of blame. So how can I model all the time that when something is wrong, we're not trying to find out who to blame, but we're trying to really talk more objectively about what occurred and how we could prevent it in the future. And just acknowledging we're all imperfect beings. Often people spend a lot of time at work trying to prove to others that they're worthy of their job, or imposter syndrome, some people call it. But what I know is that everyone's doing their best, but we're always going to make mistakes. So how do we create a culture where as colleagues, we don't point fingers, but we instead come together and move forward? The other is when people make mistakes towards me. So I've had staff and students lash out, yell at me, send angry emails. And when I forgive them, that is powerful. And our relationship becomes stronger. Like they gave me an opportunity to tell them, it's okay. I realize you lost it. Let's not do that again. What happened that made you have an outburst? But let's move forward together. So really forgiving each other having direct communication and knowing we're all in this together. We need to be a team that's strong, that moves forward on behalf of students.
I love that you mentioned Amy Edmondson as well. Like, she's come up quite a bit on this podcast. I think like she's one of the most humble people I've ever interacted with as well, given the influence of her work. And I'm just imagining how powerful that role modeling is for the students. I can't think of a time in my school life that a principal apologized, or a teacher for that matter. And I'm just thinking through, that's very unusual. What kind of impact do you see on the kids? Like that middle school girl that you apologized to, that must have changed her life.
I think that she felt respected. When we were growing up, there was no social media, there was no Google searching. The teacher and the leader, they had the information. And even if we said something wrong as a teacher like 20 years ago, a student often couldn't find the facts to tell us we were wrong. We are in a completely different information age now, where if as the adults, we pretend that we have the answers and that we're right, have that expert mindset, we'll be undermined at every turn because students have information at their fingertips. They have multiple teachers to listen to on the internet. So what we really have to do is build relationships and not think that we are the expert or need to be right all the time, because it just will not work in this day and age.
I think that's a great reminder. Whether you're a parent or a teacher, it's so easy to imagine that you know all the answers and the students are sponges. They're there to absorb your wisdom. So I think that's a great reminder to all of us listening, just to remember the age that we're in. And I like how you're talking about focusing on that relationship, because if you get that relationship, that sets the foundations and it creates the conditions for learning, which is what people go to school for. And the grades are a byproduct of learning, right? That's the ideal. But bringing us back to student voice and voice across all the different stakeholders in the district, like teachers, families as well. Let's get nerdy about the survey design that you talked about. How to approach, when to send out the surveys, what kind of questions to ask, and how to use that information to guide yourself and your cabinet over the course of the year.
This year, we did 2 surveys, a fall survey and a winter survey. And we asked some questions the same because we were curious if the timing of the year for the survey changed, how the results would change, and they did. And we also asked questions that certain committees were focused on. So in the fall, there was a focus on our facilities at the high school and upgrades. And so we asked the same questions to the students, staff, and families about their priorities for high school campus upgrades. And because we knew that right then we had a committee that was going to look at the data, act on the data, make the data public so that people got the feedback of how their survey data was going to be used. This winter for our survey, we had the school calendar questions, which we made clear when we launched the survey. This was used to inform a decision. It will again. So we always include what we're using the survey for, especially for students who are skeptical that adults are going to listen to them. When you answered this way last time, here's the action we took. So give us your input again. It was the school calendar this winter and about student technology use. You're hearing a lot about cell phone bans. We asked students, families, and staff questions about would they like a full cell phone ban at our high school. We asked questions about one-to-one devices, kids carrying around their own Chromebooks if they wanted that. And then we asked an interesting question about instructional screen time, which was how many hours on a typical day should students be assigned to be learning from a screen? And the reason this was important to us is a lot of people had different assumptions about how often students were using screens, and we had never really given any district guidance. We had some elementary school families who were very concerned about screen time and had joined our district's wellness committee. So now we're taking that survey data and having a family info night where we share the data, which one of the reasons I felt it necessary to survey at this particular time is some families really thought that they had a strong backing from other families for a cell phone ban. They couldn't understand why the district just hadn't gone for it. They've read news articles, they've talked to their friends, everyone wants this. And now we can show it's actually very mixed. And a third of the families don't want a cell phone ban, a third are not sure, and a third say yes. So this is a different type of process than if I just talked to that one family member who approached me and then made a choice based on assumptions about what the larger community was feeling. So surveys need to happen at a time when there's a group of people helping to craft them so that they can include just the right amount of information and not feel leading. And then a group of people to be able to act on them and show to the people who took the time to give us their opinions that what they said mattered. And sometimes that what they said was not aligned with a majority in the community. So they recognize that the policies maybe they're pushing for would require more support to get across the finish line.
Yeah, that's such a delicate balance that you strike, especially when asking surveys. One of the core beliefs that we have about surveys is you don't ask a question that you're not prepared to act on the answer for. And it sounds like you're being very deliberate and very clear about what you're going to ask about and how you're using that information right off the bat with the people who are responding. The other thing that I heard from you is that the survey results are there to be able to allow you to have an informed conversation about controversial issues, because now you have some data around it. But sometimes the data is not sacrosanct, because we know that surveys are great for efficient data collection and gathering the voice of a large group of people. But one of the other criticisms of surveys are that people don't always do what they say, and they don't always like what they say they like in surveys. How do you process all of this information responsibly to make good decisions informed by the surveys, but also driven by your own judgment and leadership?
We always consider the timing of surveys because they're usually one moment in time. It's maybe 1 week or one staff meeting, and events that happen around that time can heavily impact it. This fall survey, the presidential election had just occurred, and people had strong feelings about that, and we didn't know if that would cloud their general demeanor. The school calendar survey, families and students took it before the February week off, asking if they want the February week off, and then staff took it after the February week off. Some students even told me, if I had done it after the break, I would have said no because I was bored all that whole week. We always consider that the timing of when they took the survey, we know it influences the results. So it could never be like, here's the survey results, then act. It has to be, here's the survey results. What was happening around this time? And how do we gather more information if it doesn't feel conclusive enough? Another example, one of our survey questions that we ask in both fall, winter, spring is, do you feel safe? I feel safe at school. Do you agree or not? When the students took it a week before, they'd had a lockdown, the gun scare. We know that the numbers are going to drop. Other questions like, my teacher gives me challenging activities in class. Our fall survey data was much more positive than our winter, which was because the grading period had ended. So in the fall, when students took it, they hadn't received a report card from that teacher. They were generally more positive. After the marking period, it changed. So now when we look at spring versus fall, we didn't want to just say last spring, we got 10% higher this fall in student perceptions. It might have to do with the time of year aligned with the school. We consider that timing for sure. We also consider the conditions under which people took the survey. The school calendar survey for students, the first time around, we had a calendar committee of staff that were worried students wouldn't understand the concept that over the course of a calendar year, there's 180 days, and we get to decide if there's a full week off at Thanksgiving, if there's a full week off at President's, if we start before Labor Day, if we start after. So we created a slideshow that all staff were giving in their individual classrooms that laid out these concepts and the choices. And then the students took the survey in that class period. But what we heard anecdotally was that some teachers inserted a lot of their own opinions as they were delivering the slides. Some students started delivering their own opinions and calling out in class and trying to encourage their friends to vote in a certain way. We don't know how clean those survey results were. Most recent school calendar survey, now that the concept has been introduced, we were able to put it in writing and have some speech to text or text to voice for students who need it. And they took it independently. There was no explanation of the survey or opportunity for class discussion, which we think could have led to more groupthink.
We were talking about one of those occasions where you took the survey data as input and you had to balance that against other considerations and make a decision. How was that taken initially, especially with there students who felt like we've given our voice, it didn't seem to matter or it didn't count, what's going on? How do you straddle that divide between thinking that a survey is like a vote on a particular topic versus a survey is really providing your voice and your opinion that should be considered alongside everything else?
It was really tricky when we were talking about a transition to a more balanced calendar. So when I arrived here on Thanksgiving week, the students were released on Wednesday, half day, so at noon for Thanksgiving on Thursday. And what that meant is it was some of our lowest attendance of the year as families traveled or prepared for Thanksgiving. We were looking at attendance data, and there was no February break either when I got here. So essentially, school started after Labor Day. The only breaks were over December, New Year's, and spring break. School ended middle of June. So it was a pretty big shift to say, do you want to add 3 days off in November and 4 days off in February, and then end school a week later in June? We made sure from the beginning that we were just taking input. A calendar work group would be looking at this, and we have a student voice team at each school, and that student voice team meets monthly to weigh in and be the ambassadors and help us with our survey design, for example. We never send a survey to students unless other students have previewed it and given us their opinion. And they always have a suggestion that makes the survey better, in my experience. This isn't a vote like you would vote for the president. This is input as we explore this topic. And it was hard because the input was split. Families and staff tended towards wanting to add these breaks and extend the school year into June. Staff and students were a little mixed. They weren't as in support of it, but we ended up doing it anyway. And that didn't feel good. And what we did is we were super transparent about it with students. We heard your voice. We know you're not sure about this. We still think it's a good idea because of this research. Here are all the results. We share usually a summary that's really easy to see with some headlines, and then we share all the raw data. And I haven't had that happen yet, but I would love it for a person to say, I manipulated the spreadsheet and I figured out this micro analysis. And have you thought about the data this way? Because I just haven't had the capacity to splice and dice the data in every way. But we always share the raw data just in case someone is ready to do that. And we want to make sure people trust the data we're showing them. Students, I think that some of them were disappointed, but they're used to not feeling heard. And so being told, we saw your input and we're going in a different direction, but we want you to have input again in a year and a half, that was better than what they're used to, which is not being asked in the first place. And we did that in public meeting at the board. And then I've been sending emails directly to students as well, so that they hear it from me and don't have to go to a board meeting or look at a transcript. And on our school board, we've added 2 student representatives, a junior classman and a senior classman or woman. We've had both girls and boys on there, and they have an advisory vote on everything. So I just met with them for lunch and we looked over the survey results, which now the students are for the calendar with more breaks and a longer school year in June. And they will have an advisory vote during the next board meeting to accept the recommendation of the calendar staying as it's been for the past year and a half.
Wow, it's very transparent of you to publish the data in raw form. And I love how you manage to be very transparent and open about the fact that you were doing something different from what the student voice was pointing towards. And if you're releasing that data raw, do you have any concerns around confidentiality? People saying, oh, is there going to be some reprisal? Someone somewhere is going to notice what I said?
Well, all the surveys are anonymous, so there's no names attached or emails. I remove the timestamp sometimes if that helps, but usually that's not something that people can track back to a respondent. And then I do have to read all the comments because every survey I've given, like one family member says, fire this staff member, or one student writes something that's a little profane or not related to the question. Or my favorite response recently just said chicken. It was said optional, if you'd like to describe why you chose your answers about the school calendar. Chicken was the answer. I actually left that one in because maybe there's something I'm just not aware of. But I do have to preview and redact any comments that are slanderous or profane. And I think the reason I do that too is I mentioned trust and like mistakes. There's a good chance. I'm a small town superintendent. I don't have an assistant superintendent. I don't have a data team. I'm doing a lot of different things in the course of a day, a lot of interruptions. I might make a mistake. And what I think I've built is a culture where if someone sees the data and thinks something's wrong, they will reach out to me. Or if someone goes to their colleague and says, I think the superintendent messed with that data. She said this percentage, it doesn't look right. That colleague will say, why don't you ask her? And they'll know that if I was wrong, obviously I'll be frustrated with myself, but I'll write a correction and say, I made an error. Here's the accurate data. And I think that would give me an opportunity to show that I'm open to feedback and committed to accuracy. This isn't about loyalty. This isn't about me looking good. This is about accurate data used to inform decisions.
So this is coming across very strongly in your leadership and your leadership principles, that idea of integrity, being very upfront and transparent. How do you think that has evolved over time? When you think about your own personal leadership journey, do you feel like this has always been true? Or do you feel like along the way there are certain crucible moments that you went through that have cemented this for you?
I think I've always had a tendency to want to share everything. There was a moment where that wasn't working because the staff was having information overload. And I was having this assumption because I shared all the Google Docs. You have all the links. That was good communication. And I've now realized I had a chief operating officer at the charter school. I was a principal in Brooklyn after I was a public district's principal. I went to Brooklyn and she said to me, Linda, no one can keep track of all your Google Docs and what's in your head about all that. So we created the concept of a home base where there would be a headline of a document and what it was and a summary of what it said, and then a link if people wanted to dig deeper. So that was a pretty big moment for me, realizing that transparency is not sharing everything just raw. Transparency is letting people have access to go there if they want to, but having much tighter talking points so people can grasp it quickly when they have lots of things on their plate. Another piece that I'm going through right now that has been a challenge is sometimes sharing all the information when I have it creates confusion or nervousness in the community. And the process we're going through right now is around upgrades to the high school campus. And the campus right now, students learn in 5 different buildings throughout the course of the day. There's no fenced-in perimeter. It's like a college campus. So there's some safety concerns. The buildings are almost 100 years old, and there's concerns about HVAC, seismic. So this is a pretty huge, complicated master planning construction process. And the architects are helping me realize, okay, we just got a scheme from the architect, link it to the website. And they're saying, no, you don't want to share this detailed thing that we're doing with all the square footage because someone's going to fixate on one piece of it that's going to change because we're in this very iterative process. And so, yes, the Long Range Facilities Committee that every month is tracking this, they can see more detailed plans. But we actually think that sharing more detailed plans with everyone right now could create confusion and take us off message. And so I'm getting comfortable being a little more paternalistic to decide what information people should have at each time. But I've been reframing that. It's not about I'm trying to control information or hide information. I'm trying to really make sure that the information people have is more fully crafted so that it doesn't feel like it keeps changing and they can't pay attention to anything, and that the information they have is at the right level for people's typical engagement with a project like this. I can't expect everyone to look at the architect's 65-page report. There needs to be better talking points and then access to that report when it's closer to what we can actually provide to the community.
That's a really great example. And I want to pick up on that process that you just described, where you reframed this whole thing to yourself and you were conscious that doing so would help you move forward in the direction that would mature your own leadership. How did you learn to do this? And this process of reflection, reframing, and processing all this information that you have to deal with as leader to improve your own leadership, was that something that you learned along the way, or is this something that you just developed as you went along?
I think when I was a younger leader, I was less secure in the fact that I deserve to be the leader. And I think I practiced leadership in a way that I thought I had to be perfect. And I thought I knew what I needed to do. And now that I've had more time, I've had the fortune of having colleagues who were brave enough to call me out when I was going off on the wrong track. And we had a relationship where I could listen to them. And I realized that those were the most helpful moments, not just for my own leadership development, but for the organization. And so it made me realize that I needed to build a culture where everyone felt comfortable giving and receiving feedback for the benefit of the organization. And no one felt a need to try to prove their worth, be perfect, not make mistakes. And instead, we needed an environment that had a lot of direct communication. People felt comfortable saying, like I said to someone the other day, I'm flipping back and forth. Every day I have a different opinion about this upcoming decision we have, and I don't know what to say, which is very different than what I think may have happened in the past, where the person I had the closest relationship with, or the person who was the most vocal, or the person I spoke to last had more influence over me than now, where I feel like I'm getting feedback a lot and I'm incorporating it and trying to get more feedback. And I'm always questioning if I'm right, not in the way I used to maybe, which was in negatives. Oh no, I'm wrong, but more in a curious. I think I might not be right here. Let me make sure that the people around me are comfortable giving a different perspective and that I can hear it. And so in the case with the facility project and how transparent to be and what information to give at a certain time, making sure that there are people who've done it before, who can share why, who I can feel comfortable saying, that doesn't sound right. So digging into the why and me feeling comfortable sharing, like I worried, I don't want to be a paternalistic leader who is hoarding information for power. And that's this vision I have in my head that I needed to release and explore so that I wasn't fighting against an image, but then losing an opportunity to grow in the correct direction.
This is one of those things that I believe that any good leader needs to develop, that the idea of constantly being open to feedback, constantly surrounding yourself with people that can almost be a check and balance to yourself and being secure enough in that ability. Do you do this deliberately? You spoke about like student advisory councils, and it sounds like you have a system that you go through and you implement these systematically so that you're constantly getting this feedback. Maybe talk me through like how you think about creating that system around you.
For my personal growth, the Center for Creative Leadership in Greensboro, North Carolina was very helpful. They facilitated my staff taking like the leadership circle profile and Myers-Briggs and getting input, where I learned that I was holding on, like there's some perfectionism that I was showing about myself that was not making people around me to make mistakes or take risks in front of me because they saw me being hard on myself and worried about being hard on the product. I had some good coaching to unlearn those behaviors that have been entrenched in me since I was a young girl. And in terms of the staff as a whole, 360 reviews, we haven't done them here yet, but I've found them to be helpful. This idea that people give feedback to their supervisors. It's not just one-way feedback, and people give feedback to their lateral colleagues who know them best. Also, every meeting that we have, there are different roles, and one of the roles is a process observer. They can interject during the meeting if they like, but at the end of the meeting, they must share out how we work together and what they noticed. I'm often the facilitator of those meetings if it's the principals and department heads, and that process observer is then authorized and charged to say things like, this meeting didn't go well, we didn't have enough information in advance, or it was us talking together the whole time. And one time a principal said, Linda, we just need time to talk to each other about teacher observations. And this agenda was packed with district level things we're not as excited about giving input on. They said, we don't want to give input on all the decisions or narratives messaging you're about to send out, Linda. Obviously, the first time I heard it, I was like, oh no, I've done something wrong. But then I quickly talked myself out of that initial knee-jerk reaction to, okay, that makes sense. And that's authorizing me to make some more decisions without input and be more strategic about what we're spending our meeting time doing. So that process observer role, I think, is a way to regularly embed feedback into our work.
That is so powerful. Who is this person? Is it like a rotating kind of
It
job?
rotates. At the beginning of 5 minutes of every meeting, it is finding our roles, which are facilitator, note taker, timekeeper, process observer, and then agenda build. Often I've created agenda based on what we said in the last meeting. And then I'll say, is there anything that's missing? Anything that feels more important? Do the times look right? And we go through that at the end of every meeting. What are the next steps? And what does our next meeting agenda look like? And do we need to change anything in our next meeting agenda? And all of this is on a shared Google spreadsheet for the whole year. Every meeting they're going to, they can see the draft agenda, they can add things to it, they can either ask ahead of time and it changes then, or in the meeting say, we need to make sure we take 15 minutes for this pressing item. And I like that because nowadays when I go to a meeting and I haven't seen an agenda ahead of time, I don't have access to the materials, I don't feel like I can meaningfully participate.
Yeah, I have to say, this is the highest degree of meeting discipline I have heard on this show. There's a study by Bain and Company on the number of hours spent in meetings by management teams and education cabinet teams. It's a lot. And without this meeting discipline that you've put in place, a lot of that time is just frittered away. I don't know if you're open to it, but if you could share, like even just a template of how you capture that, I think that our listeners would
Yeah,
love
and
that.
some of it is influenced by liberatory structures. Every meeting starts with assigning roles and agenda build. Next is a welcoming ritual. And that came social emotional learning concept. And we used to have to pick a different welcoming ritual. What are you having for dinner? Things like that. We actually stopped that. It took too much time. And now we just say, what is on your heart and or mind as you enter this meeting that you want this group to know? And sometimes they're sharing, my dog's at the vet and I'm going to be looking at my phone because I'm stressed. So sorry. Sometimes they're sharing something great that happened, or sometimes they're saying I've had a terrible day. My mind's not in this meeting, but I'm going to do my best. So starting with that welcoming ritual is really helpful. And then I often pack too many agenda items in, but we try to do no more than 2. These are like hour and a half meetings, hour 15. And at least one of those items, there needs to be time where people do independent partner or small group work. Whenever we find a meeting's all whole group discussion, it just isn't as good. And then, as I mentioned, we end it with next steps and process observer and then optimistic closure. And the optimistic closure can be what worked well in this meeting, what are you looking forward to, or giving a shout out to a colleague who's been helpful to you. End on a high note.
I love that. And we'll transcribe all of that and put that in our show notes for anyone who's curious about improving the quality of their meetings. I'm now thinking about stealing some of that in high-level meetings.
Some people don't like it. I have to be honest. Like, it takes people a while to get used to the welcoming ritual and optimistic closure because some people thought of it as fluff. But
Yeah.
over time, now that it's just part of the ritual, I think it's really important that we see each other as humans. And the other principle, if you decide you don't want to do a welcoming ritual, that's okay. But a meeting has to start with everyone's voice in the room. If you start a meeting with one person talking for a long time and then you say, any questions or thoughts, the space was never activated. So that welcoming ritual is a way to activate the space. So everyone has already spoken and it creates a conversational tone. It's not a one-way meeting of sharing information that could be in an email. And instead, people feel comfortable interrupting with questions along the way and feel inspired to share.
I've got really fascinated about the art and science of meetings because it's so much a part of leadership. Actually, it's like the tactical block and tackling of leadership is really meetings. And if we don't get that piece right, it's really difficult actually to lead effectively. You're all constantly swimming against the tide if your meetings are weak and not as disciplined as they should be. On that note, there's so many things that we've talked about today. If you had one piece of advice that you could share, and this is tough, I know, like within a 30-second soundbite, to someone in education and educational leadership thinking about taking that next step in their career, what would you tell them?
As educators make their way, some people say up the ranks. I went from a teacher to a principal to a superintendent. The job gets more complicated, but equally hard, I would say, in many ways. And the toughest shift for me was orienting towards the adults who I get work done through or with. So I don't teach classes anymore. I do have the chance to meet with students and try to do more of that. But how do you shift to working with primarily adults as an education leader, yet keep students at the center? So if you can do that, you'll be golden. How can you improve the student experience? By building a team of adults who are willing to hear feedback and make change.
Building that student experience through adults and orienting towards getting work done with adults, yet keeping students at the center. I think that's a really powerful advice, and I think you've encapsulated pretty much everything that you said today in that tight little soundbite. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for being on the show and being so generous with your insights, everything from survey design to listening to student voice to building trust and even running good meetings. I did not expect to go there today, but that was a really powerful masterclass in the block and tackling of leadership. So thank you so much, Linda. I really appreciate having you on the show. And thank all of you for listening. This has been the Engaging Leadership Show. This is CT signing off. And that's all for the Engaging Leadership Show today. If these stories resonated with you at all, head over to engagingleadershipshow.com, all one word, where you can subscribe for free to receive more leadership stories and strategies every week. Also, at that link, you can access the archive of all the featured episodes we published in summary form. It's a veritable treasure trove of educational leadership wisdom distilled for your learning pleasure. Once again, the link is engagingleadershipshow.com. Sign up today to receive the next summary this very week. Until next time, keep leading with purpose and passion, and I'll see you in the next episode.